Okay, so today we're going to talk about the civil war in Russia. And as I told you yesterday, we did the first part of the civil war stage where the Bolsheviks fight the socialists, the Mensheviks and the SRS, Committee of the Constituent Assembly, Kolchak coup d'etat. All that ends with the end of World War I as a new political situation of Russia at the end of 1918. So this is where we're beginning to this story now. This is all information based on my book, which is called Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Political Parties and Social Movements in Russia. So the book is available on Amazon.com and it was published by Princeton University Press. So my key idea here is that there were several parallel civil wars in Russia, and one should distinguish between the frontline civil war and a non-frontline civil war. Usually, people, when you say civil war, have an American model in mind, which is you have a civil war, which means you have a government, and you have an army, and you have the army in the north, the army in the south, they fight, and under their territory, there's sort of a semblance of law and order. There's police, there's people actually live normal lives. And, one of the incidents that just totally shocks me when I read about American Civil War. There's a farmer in Pennsylvania who demanded compensation because his farm was harmed by the Northern Army passing through, and he, of course, got it. Now, in Russia, there's nothing like that. Nobody compensates anybody. And in addition to the front line, there is a civil war within the territory controlled either by the Reds or the Whites or some others. There will be others. Ukrainians, gangs of all. The story begins in December 1918 because the Germans withdraw from Ukraine. They lost the war and now they're withdrawing. And the very, very first stage of that frontline civil war is the so-called foreign intervention. The British and the French are really upset with the Bolsheviks. They hate them because they're communists, they want to subvert the capitalist system, and because from their point of view, they're traitors who made a deal with the Germans at the most difficult hour, and they have to be punished. So the British and the French organized an expeditionary force, and they sent it to, actually with explicit purpose, to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. That's what they want. And the British and the French ships come to Odessa, and they land in Crimea and in Odessa. Crimea is known to them from an expedition 100 years earlier. Well, not 100, 70 years earlier, in the Crimean War. And they take over Odessa, but then they realize that Russia is such a mess and such chaos that it would be virtually impossible to proceed any further. Because the territory that is used to be called Southern Russia, now it's called Ukraine, is just chaos. There are gangs and bands of all kinds who basically warlords who control a few villages, a province, and they move here, they requisition grain, they rob population. There's no way you could get into this mess and get her out alive. So they pretty much stay put. And even then they abandoned the idea in April. It only lasted for a few months. The French were the one who were really pissed off because the Bolsheviks refused to honor the debts of the Tsarist government to France, and the French lost a whole lot of money on if the Bolsheviks stayed in power. They're still upset about it 100 years later. But at that time they were really upset. They really wanted to kick the Bolsheviks, but they didn't have any power. The British also were not particularly strong, but the British had huge supplies of arms that was supposed to be for the campaign of 1919 and 1920. And so they was kind of useless. So once it was useless, could it be given to the Russians? And so they begin to arm Tsarist generals who were willing to continue to fight against the Bolsheviks for the Allies. So this is the first phase in the south, which we would call Southern Russia - Ukraine. Now, at the same time, as I said, we have to cover the events in the east, which is Admiral Kolchak and his adventure. So as I told you before, Kolchak seizes power in November 1918, overthrowing the government of the SRs, the Constituent Assembly. He kills them and basically establishes a military dictatorship. And then there's a spectacular success for the next 4 months. So up until March, April 1919, Kolchak is making amazing victories. So he's basically taking over all of the Urals with its industry, and of course all of Siberia, since that's the territory controlled by the Komuch. But then he begins an offensive and goes towards the Volga River, and at the point of his greatest success, he comes close, but never to the same level as Komuch government a year later. So pretty much approaching the Volga River with the Kolchak white regime. They call whites because they're Tsarist officers who basically want they're monarchists. They're really right wing. And now, when I wrote the book, I actually studied the reports of an American consul. Even today, there's an American consulate there, and in the archives, I read these reports. So this information is not from anybody but American sources. And usually the letters, I read them all, they started like, "Dear Secretary Lansing," and then he would describe what he's describing, and then it's very interesting the way they used to sign those diplomatic reports. "Your obedient servant," that's how they would sign it. Yes. Yes. And in these reports, basically there's a very colorful picture of what the white regime looked like. It was with great approximation that you can call it a political power. There was actually no power. There was revenge. There was Tsarist detachments of officers who would put an officer and watch over a factory, and there's lots of factories in the Urals. That's the industrial area. Be suspicious of any attempt to voice any political opinion, and if you do, they shoot you or hang you. Their favorite method of execution was actually hanging, and leave the corpses so that people would see it far away, and there would be like lots of them around industrial cities. It was really a military dictatorship. So that's what Admiral Kolchak regime was like. There was some production, the factories did continue to work, but there was no attempt to establish any sort of normalcy and cooperation or some kind of attempt to do anything. It was just, you do it or else we'll kill you. That's pretty much the policy of Admiral Kolchak. But even on his territory, there was no control of a state government like we associate with state authority. There were huge parts of Siberia that were under what is really a Chinese model, warlords. Like one of the most famous ones was Semyonov, who was a gangster, basically a gang of several thousand soldiers around Irkutsk and Baikal area. And they would terrorize the population, steal and murder and basically do whatever they want, and there was no state authority to control them, and they controlled huge territories. Siberia is very big. That nobody could do anything with these warlords. Anyway, by July 1919, Kolchak offensive sort of fizzled out, and there you could say that the big role is played by Trotsky, who is building up the new Red Army. And he was quite successful about it. Trotsky's role in winning against the whites is obviously the crucial one. The Bolsheviks are really good about two things: propaganda and organization. And this is actually one of the key reasons why, in the end, they would win, despite the catastrophic economic policies. But they're really good at this. They're really good at propaganda. They were professional propagandists and journalists. And agitation and propaganda, agitprop, it's called in Russian, and organization, organizing the masses. It's very important to understand for the course of the Russian Civil War. If you imagine a village and the Bolsheviks come there, what are they going to do? The first thing they're going to do is shoot the kulaks or the collaborators or Tsarist officers, Red Terror in a small scale. Then they're going to find the poor ones, create a poor men's committee, and organize. The whole thing will be covered with committees and detachments and some kind of propaganda work and work among women and work against the church. They love working with the masses. and organizing the masses. And then, of course, they would requisition grain, assemble the young boys, and draft them to the army. If the whites come to the village, they actually have no political agenda at all, other than to kill the communists or the socialist sympathizers or the Jews. And that's what they're going to do. And the rest of it stays on its own. So they had actually no social policy. They had no economic policy. They had no policy at all other than hold on to power by force. That is not a very effective way of government. So by July 1919, the Kolchak forces are pushed out pretty much to the Urals. And it would take another year until little by little, slowly, the Red Army is going to continue to advance to the Far East. It's huge. Russia is very, very big, double the size of the United States. And so it takes time for the Red Army. But it was no longer a threat to the communists. But at this same point, another threat appeared that nobody thought was credible or serious. And it turned out to be even more dangerous for the Bolsheviks than the Kolchak. And the name of the general is Denikin, General Denikin. General Denikin is probably one of the most talented generals, similar to Ludendorff in World War I, in that era. It was absolutely spectacular what he managed to accomplish. So let me explain to you what General Denikin did. General Denikin is his army is known as the Volunteer Army. And in the beginning, they had a few thousand of white officers, just a few thousand. And they were stuck in the North Caucasus, holding a few villages. And basically, that's all they could do. But then with the coming of the British and the French to Crimea and to Odessa, they began to arm the Denikin's army. And they began to expand. And at first they had 30,000, then 40,000, then 50,000. But all of that would not have mattered. If it was only that, then they wouldn't have made it. British help was nice, but it would not have made it to what they actually managed to accomplish. The big thing that happened that I described in great detail in the book is the Cossack Rebellion. The Cossacks were Russian and Ukrainian farmers who were armed, as you know, because that's their way of life, because they were fighting the Chechens and the Turks. They had charters from Catherine II, and then in the 19th century they began to be a part of Imperial Guard. So the Cossacks are like basically, I call them Russian cowboys. I mean, they're agriculturalists, but they are armed and they can be assembled in a minute. The way it works is the church bell rings, all the armed men with the horse and saber and a gun come to the church square, and then they have their tenth and the hundreds and the thousands. They can build an army within a matter of hours. So what happens basically is that the Bolsheviks, when they move into Ukraine and southern Russia, which is one and the same thing at that time, they start to requisition grain like everywhere else from the Cossacks. But you see, the Russian peasants can't resist that much, but the Cossacks can. And they fight them back. They're not, you're not going to take my grain from me for free? No way, man. So they fight back. And the Bolsheviks have launched a program that's called de-Kossakization. They want to liquidate the Cossacks as a class, which means to disarm them and force them to work and to surrender their labor for the working class for free. Ain't gonna work with the Cossacks. They raise a rebellion, and 50,000 Cossacks join 50,000 on the Denikin army as partners. And that becomes 100,000 really well-armed, excellent, professional army that can fight any enemy. And they do miracles. By June, he has 100,000. And by July, he's now in Kharkov, which is today the border town between Ukraine and Russia. At that time, it was purely a Russian city. And then he moves on into central Russia. And by October, this is the highest peak of Denikin's offensive. He's in the city of Oryol, which is 200 kilometers from Moscow. Absolutely spectacular offensive. I read British reports about it, and the British correspondent made an interview with Denikin. What are you going to do when you come to Moscow? He said, I'm going to run for presidency, and I hope they're going to elect me. The Bolsheviks were in panic. They actually know from the archives they were preparing foreign passports just in case Denikin would enter Moscow. Another interesting moment was that they asked him, the British correspondent asked him how he would explain that there are anti-Jewish pogroms. And he said, well, Russian people are bad, and I can't do anything about it. That's just the way it is. Let me tell you about the pogroms, because pogroms are very important. There's a lot of Jews in southern Russia, and there were a lot of pogroms. Pogroms were done by Ukrainian Cossacks, by Russian Cossacks, and by the Tsarist officers. The Tsarist officers' pogroms were somewhat different because they were in the nature of avenging, vengeance to the commissars and communists. Since many of the Jews were, leftist Tsars, SRs, and Mensheviks, and in Mensheviks, very many Jews, and in the communists too. Their vengeance was political. They were killing them not because they were Jews, but because they were communists, who happened to be also Jews. The Cossacks were killing the Jews because they were Jews. And moreover, what's so interesting in this phenomenon, they were killing them not out of hatred, but it was called, I call this in my book, killing for entertainment. They were having fun killing the Jews. It's entertainment. It was laughter and wine and rape. They are having a grand party, and in the meantime, killing the Jews. And here I want to tell you a personal story, and maybe we'll finish with that because there's more to say, but I don't want to rush it. In 1990, in Ukraine, in Kiev, we had a great time, and she was 90-something. And I asked her, Grandma, do you remember the Civil War? And she said, yeah, of course I do. And so, well, what do you remember? I was so eager to just hear, I'm writing a book on the Civil War. Can you tell me something? And she said, yeah, I remember very well that Mama comes to me and says, run to the fields. She was 14 at that time. And lie low, just lie down in the fields in wheat so that nobody can see. Wait until I come. Wait as long as it takes. 1 day, 2, 3. Just stay as long as you can. And this is what my grandmother did. She ran to the fields and lay down there. And when she came back, her mother did come back. Her mother was raped, and there was a lot of people killed. And that's a Jewish pogrom. What is most amazing about it is there's some hatred too, but a lot of it is just for fun. It's murder for fun. The official data is that in these 1919 summer pogroms, 200,000 Jews were murdered in this fashion. So that's another reality of this lawlessness and vengeance and chaos in Ukraine during the Civil War. I'll stop at that, and then we're going to next time continue with the winding down of Denikin's campaign, and then the next stage would be the Peasant War, would be stage 3